The world of geopolitics is complex. It encapsulates foreign policy, defense, trade, and culture. These can have ripples that can be felt all around the planet.
With that, we welcome you to The Global Detail, a podcast where we go beyond borders and behind the headlines to stories that impact the world.
Our goal is to peel the onion and explore the various diverse layers through riveting interviews with experts and stalwarts. I'm Akshobh Giridharadas.
And co-piloting this journey, I'm Brendan Duke. Let's get into it.
On September 11, 2001, now codified as 9/11, the two towers of the World Trade Center in New York City came crashing down. And with them, so did the foundations of American security. It was a terrorist attack that would change the contours of geopolitics, national security, and launch the global war on terror.
Almost a decade later, the architect of that terrible day, Osama Bin Laden, was found hiding in Abbottabad, Pakistan. This begs the question, how did the world's most wanted man end up safely ensconced, undetected, and likely protected in a guarded town in an ally country?
May 2021 marked a decade since the assassination of Osama Bin Laden. The lead envoys on that fatal night were Husain Haqqani, then Pakistani Ambassador to the United States, and Cameron Munter, then American Ambassador to Pakistan. On the 10-year anniversary, the Global Detail spoke exclusively to both gentlemen who were handling their respective countries' affairs in their counterparts' nations. With this, we examine the Rashomon Effect of the killing of Osama Bin Laden.
And what is the Rashomon Effect, you ask? It was a term immortalized after Akira Kurosawa's 1950 movie, Rashomon. It refers to a phenomenon wherein the same event is explained in different ways by different people. With that, we ask, how was the killing of Osama bin Laden interpreted by the two countries involved?
Abbottabad, Pakistan is a garrison town just north of the capital Islamabad. It's home to the Kakul Military Academy, Pakistan's very own West Point. The incredulity of finding the world's most wanted man right across from the famed military academy sent shockwaves. The Global Detail spoke to Cameron Munter in Prague and Husain Haqqani in Washington, D.C. Both have now left government and work in the private sector and non-profit space. We begin with Ambassador Cameron Munter, who was closest to the events on the ground on May 2nd, 2011.
The role of an ambassador is tricky in the sense that you are representing your government, but you're also doing your best to make sure that the other government understands what your government is doing. And I think the person who really takes the prize for doing that well was Husain Haqqani. At a very difficult time of U.S.-Pakistani relations, Husain was trusted by the Americans as being able to give them very tough, assessments at the same, but very honest ones. And not people who do this are not always appreciated. And I think Husain came in for some criticism in Islamabad, but what he was doing was trying to get the Americans to understand a very tricky situation. So he and I would talk from time to time during our tenures and talk about how we were trying so much between our two countries to make sure that people understood what was going on. At that time, I came to Islamabad in October of 2010. And I knew I had been briefed before I came to Islamabad about the house in Abbottabad. I was briefed by our intelligence agencies that they weren't sure that this is where bin Laden was, but that they had a pretty good idea. So this is, a good 6 months before the raid. Now, I'm not an intelligence officer, so I didn't know about the specific plans for the raid, how that would work, and all of the kind of detail that you can find in other places. But what I did know is that it was likely that this raid would take place, and when that was the case, my job was going to be to clean up the mess. And look, that's what ambassadors do. You may recall that 2011 was not an easy year. We began the year with events such as the assassination of Salman Taseer. in Pakistan. And shortly after that, we had the so-called Raymond Davis case and the ongoing issues of drone strikes. So there was quite a bit of tension in the relationship. And those of us who were trying to make sure that things were understood, people like Hussein, people like myself, we had a tough task making sure that both sides understood. So my point at that time was to say, how do I make sure that my interlocutors, my people I spoke with in Pakistan, are aware of what American priorities are, and that Americans get the best sense of what the Pakistani priorities were? It wasn't easy, again, as I mentioned, because of these other crises. So imagine a very tense time, April, May, end of April in 2011. And what happened to me then was that shortly before the raid, I was informed it would take place. And but the whole point was to keep doing things as you do them normally. So, for example, on the day of the raid, we had a volleyball game with the Chinese embassy. And you won't be surprised to know that the Chinese crushed us. They were a lot smaller than we were, but they were more disciplined. Maybe that's a metaphor. Anyway, we did that. And that evening, I was even hosting a dinner of every rector of every Islamic university in Pakistan, about 12 people. I got the call that the raid would go on during the middle of this dinner, and I did what no ambassador should do, which is I left my dinner and I went into the embassy and spent the rest of the night there.
Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, Husain Haqqani's phone was about to explode. He was about to touch down in London, but he would not catch his connecting flight to Islamabad. His return and his remaining tenure in Washington was about to turn upside down.
In those days, you didn't have Wi-Fi on planes. So I switched off my phone and slept. And once I landed, I turned my phone on. And of course, there were 149 missed calls and there were hundreds of text messages. And the first text message I saw was about, all of them were about the raid, but that this raid had happened and the president had announced. So I immediately got off, went to the counter. I knew what would happen. I would have to go back. So I went to the counter, introduced myself and said, can I go back on the plane when it goes back to Washington? And then the second call I made was to the presidency in Pakistan, to speak with the president of Pakistan, who updated me on what had happened. And immediately told me that I will be sent a copy of the statement that the Pakistani government had already issued, which I believe our foreign secretary had drafted, which acknowledged that Pakistan had an obligation under UN resolutions to cooperate in the elimination of Bin Laden. That it was upset that the US had taken action unilaterally, but it welcomed the fact that the chapter on Bin Laden had been closed. And then I returned to Washington, D.C. I edited an op-ed that was going to appear the next morning, written by the president of Pakistan, explaining Pakistan's position on the matter, and landed, went straight to the CNN studio in Washington, D.C., appeared on Wolf Blitzer's show, again explaining the Pakistani position, which was that even though he was found in Pakistan, please don't think that the government of Pakistan was keeping him there, and that we will investigate the matter. But there is a backstory to all this. And the backstory is that I became ambassador in 2008 while the Bush administration was still in office. And it was the point at which transition was taking place from the Musharraf administration, the military dictatorship, to a civilian government, and I was the appointee of the civilians. The Bush administration had actually bought into the Pakistani story, which Musharraf had put out, that maybe Bin Laden's dead. And getting him had not been a priority for the Bush administration in its waning period. So Bin Laden didn't come up until President Obama was elected. And after he was elected, one of the first things that I heard from Obama administration officials during my first briefing with the then CIA director, Leon Panetta, the question was, hey, we want to get bin Laden and we want full cooperation on it. And I informed Islamabad that things have changed on the subject of bin Laden. If we have even the minutest intelligence on the matter, we should be sharing it with the Americans because this could become a sore point later. The reason why I remember all this is that because after the dust settled, after the events that Cameron just now narrated, uh, Pakistanis went into typical denial mode. Instead of trying to find out who helped bin Laden, they decided to try and figure out who helped the Americans find bin Laden, and created a whole hoopla about American agents in Pakistan and how that had been facilitated, etc., overlooking the main issue. How did the world's number one terrorist stay in Pakistan for so long? If he didn't have official support, then what non-state actors were supporting him and who they were? And so then domestic Pakistani politics took over, and it became a whole question of trying to find scapegoats. And of course, one of the scapegoats was yours truly. So at that point, I looked back at everything I had sent Islamabad since I became ambassador, and I had actually flagged the bin Laden issue after each meeting in which it was raised with me by any American. Most interesting of all was a 2010 October conversation between Pakistan's army chief, General Kiani, our foreign minister, and the president of the United States, who had dropped in on a meeting between us and the National Security Advisor in Washington, D.C. And in that meeting, and my note said that, the note that I had sent to Islamabad, President Obama had used very interesting language. He had said, we want to find and eliminate bin Laden. I mean, words to that effect. We would like to do it with Pakistan's cooperation, but very frankly, if we do not get effective cooperation, we will do what we have to do by ourselves. So when this happened and the Americans didn't take it into confidence, something that annoyed Pakistanis very much, I reminded everyone that basically President Obama was being true to his word. He had warned us. It's just that we didn't understand the warning. And unfortunately, it's been 10 years, but there still hasn't been a full accounting from Pakistan as to who helped bin Laden. I am not one of those who thinks anybody in government officially did it, but whoever did it needs to be discovered and identified, and that hasn't been done.
Ambassador Haqqani suddenly found himself between a rock and a hard place. The narrative for Pakistan soon became, was Pakistan complicit or just incompetent?
Well, basically, I couldn't say anything on the subject because I really was not privy to anything. I mean, I wasn't in Pakistan. I was not the district administrator of Abbottabad. I was not in the intelligence services of Pakistan. So how was I to know, was Pakistan complicit or incompetent? So my point always, consistently, something that was approved by my government, because I never did anything without prior approval from Islamabad. That's another thing. Ambassador Munter would agree with me, that as ambassador, you tell your government what you think is right or wrong, but you always follow the instructions that come from the capital. You don't make policy, you execute it. So I kept telling Islamabad, and I had full approval from them, that we need a full, proper, and complete investigation into the matter as to whose incompetence it was, if it was incompetence, and whose complicity it was, if it was complicity.
Many remember the famous photo by Pete Souza of President Obama, then Vice President Biden, and then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in the Situation Room as the raid was going on. Meanwhile, in Islamabad, Ambassador Munter sat in his own Situation Room, watching.
Well, look, if I give a little bit of the account of what happened that night, and then the next morning, perhaps this will fill in some of the gaps here. You know, when we watched the actual event, I was at the embassy watching it on a screen with my intelligence officers at the embassy. The event itself, actually, when you see the movie Zero Dark 30, it came off actually, quite similar to what was in the movie. I take issue with a lot of the details of that movie that have to do with the intelligence gathering beforehand. But the actual raid happened that way. The first helicopter showed up. It landed outside of the compound and secured the perimeter. The second helicopter was supposed to hover above the building, and instead it crashed. And, the sense of many of us who remembered the aborted American raid or the failed American raid in 1980 in Iran, we thought, oh my God, we fucked this up again, to put it in diplomatic language. And instead, what we found was that the team, instead of coming down on top of the house on ropes, they went up through the house and eventually were able to kill Bin Laden. They took from the house an enormous amount of information, that is to say, hard drives, computers, disks, every kind of thing they could. And that is part of the story about, competence versus complicity that I'll get to in a minute. So they took a treasure trove of information from the house when they left. So they were able to leave, and they probably would have gone in and gone out without notice had the helicopter not crashed and had it not been necessary to blow up the helicopter. It was hard to miss that at that point. So the first helicopter took off with Bin Laden's body, with the people in the team. And I then was talking to the screen. You've seen the famous picture of, Obama and Hillary Clinton and all. I talked to the screen and said to my boss, Hillary Clinton, what do I tell the Pakistanis when they call me? And her helpful guidance was, don't tell them anything. And so I thought about this, and when the phone call that you referred to, Akshobh, I got a call at about 3 a.m. on my cell phone from the Foreign Secretary, Salman Bashir. He said, Cameron, there's been a helicopter crash in Abbottabad. What do you know of this? And I said, I'll get back to you, Salman, which is typical diplomatic talk. And he then said to me, yes, you aren't sleeping, are you? And I said, no, I'm not. The fact was, we didn't know at that time what the repercussions would be. And that next morning, I went in to see General Kayani and his intelligence chief, General Pasha. The first words out of their mouths was, congratulations, you got him. A little background here as well. In 1979, there had been an attack at the Great Mosque in Mecca. And when that happened, there was a reaction throughout the Islamic world that, the CIA must have done this. And our embassy in Islamabad was burned and 3 people were killed. So this was very much on our mind that night, as we thought there may be a very violent reaction to what happened. So much of what I spent my night doing, rather than actually working on the policy issues, was bringing all of the Americans who lived in the capital into the compound for safety. So that next morning I get up and I go and I talk to General Kayani and General Pasha, and they said, why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you let us take part? And one thing that is you hear these stories about how diplomats are duplicitous, but as Ambassador Haqqani knows, the only thing you don't have a lot of money, you don't have a lot of power, you only have your word. And so I was honest with them. I said, unfortunately, we didn't trust you enough to tell you about the raid. And this was, if either General Kayani and General Pasha were either terrific actors, or they were genuinely taken aback by my answer. I think they spent, and I think Hussein perhaps can confirm this, they spent the better part of the next 2 weeks trying to figure out how to salvage the situation. That is, how to salvage the humiliation that they felt when the Americans had made this raid without asking them, and indeed had been able to do it successfully from Afghanistan when the Pakistani authorities had, apparently not dreamed that that would be the case. Now I come back to that arsenal of information that we took out of Abbottabad before we left. Over the next months, our intelligence officers went through that information, every single bit of information. And there is no indication, at least among the intelligence that I saw that came from that information, that the higher leaders of Pakistan knew about Osama bin Laden being in Abbottabad. I think it confirms what Hussein had said. Many people in the United States, I'll give you the example of Newt Gingrich, said, "How stupid do you think we are?" Of course, they knew this. Well, this had a lot to do with Newt Gingrich's prejudices and not very much to do with evidence. So the evidence is that the Pakistani leadership did not know that he was there. There may, as Hussein has said, there may be people at the lower levels of Pakistani intelligence or other areas of the government who did know he was there. But this was an abject humiliation for the leadership of the Pakistani military and intelligence. And this made the efforts that we were involved with in the broader sense in trying to work with Pakistan on the future a lot tougher, because when you have been humiliated, it makes things very hard for you. President Zardari himself was terribly embarrassed. So we put the Pakistanis in a very tough position. But the fact is, it was our priority. Indeed, as Hussein has said, I was at the meeting in the White House in October of 20, in which Obama said what he said, that we would do it whether with help or without help. We would do it after Osama bin Laden, and get him. So that's where it came out the next day. We worked very hard, and I'm sure Hussein on his end was doing the same thing with the news. We worked very hard to try to make this not become a rupture in American-Pakistani relationship. And the fact that we remained on speaking terms, I think, is a credit to all of our efforts.
Back in America, Ambassador Haqqani faced his own line of fire in Washington. Haqqani recounts meetings with President Obama and his own suggestions to the government in Islamabad. While Pakistan and the United States publicly remained allies, the relationship behind the scenes was extremely fraught.
Multiple things. I, of course, reached out to everybody that I could speak to. And the most important thing that I noted was that even in his announcement about the incident, President Obama had avoided saying anything negative about Pakistan. He said, "We found him there." And then further, while he said that we did it unilaterally, he said, "We look forward to working with Pakistan, which has been an ally in the war against terrorism." And I picked on that, and I immediately advised my government that we can actually become partners after the fact, meaning we have already said, "Congratulations, you got him." But now the best course for us to say is, well, we are allies. And while in this particular operation we didn't do it together, we are doing everything else together. So just swallow the humiliation and move on. And the president agreed with me, President Zardari, and said, "Okay, start doing what is necessary." So we started with an op-ed in the Washington Post by the president, more or less saying something to that effect. I went on the television and the news circuit saying the same thing, that, big picture, we are allies. We'll find out who did it. It wasn't our government. It wasn't the highest echelon of our government. Yes, there might have been Islamist sympathizers at the lowest level of our bureaucracy. It's not very difficult in a country like Pakistan, and for that matter, any third world country, for somebody with a lot of means to actually live unnoticed. So we could have absorbed the humiliation, or pretended to absorb the humiliation, and moved forward. We didn't. And that was the decision, I think, of the Pakistani military leadership. The person who encouraged me to continue to do that from the American side was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Admiral Mullen. He said, your view is absolutely right. The best course right now for Pakistan, at least in America, is to not go on about the humiliation. So I did a whole tour of the Congress. I must have met 70, 80 members of both houses of Congress to try and explain this to them. But the feedback I got was something that actually um, uh, was something that I warned Islamabad about the coming rupture in relations of a different kind. Yes, diplomatic relations remain. Ambassador Munter was there. I was here. Our foreign ministers would meet, Secretary of State would meet, Pakistan's foreign minister, etc. But at a psychological level, something had happened. And I woke up to it while talking to a senator from Alabama, the senator who later on became Attorney General in the Trump administration, Jeff Sessions. And he said that, people are now asking me about Pakistan in my town halls back home in Alabama. I have never been asked about Pakistan. He had been a consistent voter for aid to Pakistan going back to the early part of his congressional career. And he said things will change because the discourse in America will think, the simplified discourse down below will be Bin Laden, that terrorist who did 9/11, he was found in Pakistan. What was he doing in Pakistan? So you have to do something to address that. Unfortunately, the mood in Pakistan was very different. And Cameron knows that better because he was there. And the mood there was that these wretched Americans have done this and da, 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 da. And so we never recovered from that. At that point, the current Prime Minister Imran Khan, who was a non-entity in opposition at that time, he had already started calling me Washington's ambassador, America's ambassador to Washington, America's ambassador to Pakistan based in Washington. That I was not representing Pakistan because the Pakistani sentiment was more important rather than the rational solution that I was offering. So while General Pasha and General Kiani kept a straight face at an official level, and General Kiani immediately came here, by the way. He came to Washington, D.C. and had a meeting with his counterpart to try and explain things and talk things. But at the same time, the sense of humiliation and embarrassment was just too much for them. And so then after that, if you remember, people started, Imran Khan led a campaign to try and block the NATO convoys. And then in November, when when American forces in Afghanistan bombed a Pakistani military post along the border because they said Taliban were present there, that caused a rupture and a suspension of the NATO lines of communication through Pakistan. So things just went totally south after that.
In spite of the dark clouds looming over this relationship, Ambassador Munter and the United States tried to mend the fences and find common ground with Pakistan.
Again, it's hard to remember now because of the things that have happened since. But in those hours, I would say the 72 hours after the raid, people like Ambassador Haqqani, people certainly like myself in Islamabad, were working on which ways we could take this obvious victory in the war against terrorism and use it to try to strengthen something that both Pakistan and America have in common, which is that they are both countries that feel that at that time, certainly this was a high priority to fight terrorism. I mean, thousands of Pakistani soldiers had died in the tribal areas of Pakistan fighting these people. I mean, this is not just an idle issue. And so what we had hoped was that we could make this into something that would make us realize what we have in common rather than accentuate the kind of differences we had. But as Ambassador Haqqani says, the conclusion was otherwise. Those in America who were inclined to be anti-Pakistani took this as proof of whatever prejudice they had. Those who were inclined to see the Americans as turning on the Pakistanis, doing something behind their back, they also did this as well. And as he mentioned, we should not take the raid out of context. Not only the Raymond Davis affair, the ongoing drone attacks, and how difficult they were on a kind of a public diplomacy level, and the so-called Salalah incident to which Hussein Haqqani has referred. This was kind of the year from hell in U.S.-Pakistani relations. And sadly, both sides retreated to the easiest, but unfortunately the least practical position, which was to say, Americans mistrusted Pakistan, Pakistanis mistrusted America. And I agree. I don't think relations have been the same since. We can speculate now, 10 years later, whether there are different kinds of opportunities for America and Pakistan. But what we had worked on so hard in the first 10 years of this century to try to build the alliance, to build the common cause in the war on terror, and indeed on the kind of relationship between our countries, those events in sequence in 2011 pretty much knocked them down.
Hussein Haqqani's seminal masterpiece, titled Magnificent Delusions, chronicles the mistrust and complete lack of understanding between Washington and Islamabad through the 7 decades. Even during the most propitious period, when relations were good, there was still much tension lingering beneath the surface.
Well, I would argue that basically it's less about not understanding each other, but having unrealistic expectations. So, the origins which I refer to, the Dulles era, the expectation was unrealistic that Pakistan would offer bases, etc., against the Soviet Union in return for money, like, say, Franco did in Spain, whereas Pakistan's concerns about India were the main thing that was driving Pakistan's policy. And while an American ambassador here wrote a long telegram about how Pakistanis basically are focused on India and have no interest in sending troops to fight communism anywhere, Americans kept giving assistance in the hope that that will happen. Now, in between, of course, there were specific successes. I mean, America did have the U-2 base, etc. Then subsequently, Pakistan did offer support in reaching out to China, etc. And so what happened was an unrealistic expectation on both sides. On the American side, that Pakistan is kind of a client state and it will do what we want them to do, which was disproved during the 1990s when the whole terrorism operations in Pakistan started. And then again, the effort to rebuild cooperation on the basis of counterterrorism after 9/11, without regard to the fact that Pakistan had a different outlook and a different interest in Afghanistan than the Americans did. Basically, because we are one people, we have this whole thing about A, we don't like to hear good news, bad news, we'd rather focus on the good news. And B, we do overestimate our importance to somebody else. So Pakistan was important to the US, but Pakistanis always assumed that because we are so important to the US has to do XYZ, which America didn't. And lastly, it was pretty sad that the president who knew Pakistan best and had actually been to Pakistan as a young man and had roommates at college who were from Pakistan and took pride in the fact that he could cook keema and he could cook dal, which he learned from his Pakistani roommates, is the president on whose watch the US-Pakistan relationship got the worst blow because of the Bin Laden raid. Now, could things have been different? What if Pakistan had been informed? I've raised that question. I've raised that question with Michael Morell, Ambassador Munter, and my friend who was the deputy director of the CIA and who was in charge of all of this. And we've gone through it many times. And very frankly, on this, I am sympathetic to the American position that the risk in taking Pakistan into confidence earlier was just too great. Supposing there was somebody in the system who was protecting him, supposing somebody in the system was sympathetic to Bin Laden, what if they tipped him off? What if he changed his location? After so much effort, he has been found, and then he escapes again. So I understand why the Americans did it, but because of what happened, things have not been the same, and I don't think will be the same for a while.
Eventually, competing narratives would add further strain to a relationship that continued to spiral downwards.
Yes, I couldn't agree. I couldn't agree more. I think that the issue here that's so interesting is, in a way, what Hussein has described as the story that a number of academics have put out, which is a story of dueling narratives, a Pakistani narrative that the Americans use Pakistan and throw them away, whether in the 1950s through their, the CENTO, or in the 1980s when working with the Mujahideen against the Russians in Afghanistan. Whether or not the Americans actually were serious about Pakistan. That's widespread notion in Pakistan. And on the American side, whether or not you give money to these Pakistanis and then they do things you don't expect. So you're absolutely right that for many years, what had seemed to be and might have been a great partnership had been based in large part on mistaken assumptions on both sides. One of the reasons that this is so difficult to accept emotionally, certainly for someone like me, and I would imagine the same for Hussein, is there are many cultural reasons why Pakistanis and Americans get along. Americans who go to Pakistan invariably, they invariably love their Pakistani friends, and vice versa. We have a thriving diaspora in the United States of people who are both proud of their Pakistani heritage and great Americans. So there's a sadness to this about what could have been. And yet these narratives that have become very powerful kind of crashed in 2011. I would argue now that there may be a point in the future. We won't go back, as Husain Haqqani has said, we won't go back to where we were. We can't repair what was there before. There may be in the future a prospect for a relationship which may be more honest, which perhaps will be a little bit less ambitious, but where we can develop the respect that I hope is kind of inherent in the relationship. And I'm hoping for that in years to come, that having gotten through this crisis, that we will see new ways in which Americans and Pakistanis can work.
While the efficiency of the SEALs is well known, I asked Ambassador Munter if at all there was some concern or a contingency plan for negotiation with the Pakistanis if the raid went south.
The actual operational details of what would happen there were not details that I was briefed on. I was a diplomat. I was not an intelligence officer. And so I didn't know the kind of detail that I would have needed to know in order to make the plans of how we negotiate what would have happened. But, for example, had, say, both helicopters been destroyed and our troops, God help us, been involved in a firefight with Pakistani authorities in some case, this would have been something that would have easily escalated into a very major event. And there was no easy plan B for that. I mean, the fact is, we could get on the phone from our military headquarters in Afghanistan with the military leadership of Pakistan. And there might have been a way through those, what we call mill links, to try to defuse any escalation of a problem. But the fact is that the plan was to go in, go out, and there was not a well-organized, to my knowledge, there was not a well-organized plan B of what to do if American soldiers had been trapped in Pakistan or had been in actual combat that unfortunately could have involved Pakistani authorities.
Both ambassadors dismissed the reporting of Seymour Hersh, wherein he alleged a vast American-Pakistani conspiracy to stage the raid and even fake high-level diplomatic incidents as a sort of cover. After 10 years, we are compelled to ask if there are still more questions than answers.
Absolutely, which is why I was an advocate of a completely transparent inquiry. even if there were officials involved, it would have been better for us to just come clean, because not coming clean has resulted in speculation. But the fact of the matter still remains that it's still speculation. Nobody has been able to offer any evidence. Seymour Hersh's story was not published in his regular outlet because they did not find a second source, a single source. And that source also, because I saw Cy Hirsch after this, in fact, just before he published his story, and I asked him about the nature of his source. He and I have been friends for years. And he said, I just have one source, an American retired person who's sharing his speculation about what might have happened. So I said, but how are you translating that into that is what happened? He said, because I think that is what happened. Now, this was, in fact, in some ways, his last big story, because after that, he kind of lost credibility, because a man who has taken pride in doing fact-based reporting, doing one final report, couldn't resist the temptation of doing one final report, which is totally speculation-based. It does not add to his credibility. But at the same time, if Pakistan had made things transparent, there would have been no room for speculation. And the fact remains, it is embarrassing for Pakistan that the world's number one terrorist was found on Pakistani soil in a town that is primarily a garrison town, and with no reasonable explanation.
I asked ambassadors Munter and Haqqani to reflect on their time in government, looking at the US-Pakistan relationship. Was it always a case of 2 steps forward and 3 steps back, given the constant fallout?
No, very briefly, I think you don't expect to be a diplomat if you're not going to deal with crisis. That is to say, for those of you, maybe some of the people who are listening, if you're thinking about a diplomatic career, it's not just going to receptions and drinking a lot of whiskey or having pleasant conversations with people like Husain Haqqani. That's the fun part. But when you're dealing with these kinds of problems, this is the kind of thing you expect, which is the reason we have diplomats, the reason we have diplomacy, is to try, when there are these very tough situations, to find the way out of it that serves the interest of your country. And if it serves the interest of the other country you're dealing with, so much the better. And in my case, what I believed is that if we could have dealt with the Bin Laden raid, with Raymond Davis, with Salalah, with all these things in a more open way, as Husain Haqqani suggests, we might have helped the interests of both countries. That was not the case. But the fact is, it was something that I felt, I guess, the way I could illustrate this is the way it works in American diplomacy is at the end of every cycle, a diplomat will write himself a rating. You will get a grade on how well you did. And I'm probably the only ambassador who ever wrote, I took what could have been a catastrophe and I limited it to a disaster. That is to say, I think, and I hope Hussein feels the same way, that by our efforts, we contributed to keeping this from being worse than it was. But that's the nature of diplomacy. It's key to remember, diplomats are not policymakers. Diplomats are executors of the policy of the country from which they come. If they can do that with a certain amount of empathy and feeling, great. But if they can't, tough luck. That's the way it works. So, I think we did our best, and I think that what happened after that, I'm still involved with Pakistan and hoping for economic and cultural and other kinds of improvements with the United States. It's just part of a process, and we happen to be there at a time of great crisis.
Ambassador Haqqani talked about the personal price he paid from his time serving in Washington. While he held the high-profile post of ambassador to the United States, the events during his tenure and the fallout back home would make it his last hurrah with the government.
I think Ambassador Munter is absolutely right. No one expects to be ambassador forever. In my case, I wasn't even a career diplomat. I was playing what I thought was an important role on behalf of a democratic government in a country that has only intermittently had democracy. I did pay a personal price. I think I made a tremendous effort, like Ambassador Munter did, to keep relations between our countries going. It was just that the tide was against both the relationship and the person advocating the relationship. I was made the poster boy for a Pakistani who wants good relations with America, manages those relations reasonably well. We got the biggest aid package in history, considering that Pakistan has always sought American aid. This was a pretty big deal. We got Pakistan's military got its toys. They got a squadron of F-16s without congressional objections for the first time in history. Even in the 50s, they never got it without any objection. And they got ships for the Navy, etc. But the basic fact remains that, as I have written in Magnificent Delusions, the heart of a lot of Pakistanis was not in the relationship. And in the end, after the Bin Laden raid, somebody was needed to be be held responsible for how the Americans dishonored Pakistan, and I became that guy. But the fact remains that from Pakistan's point of view, I still believe it would have been far better to have dealt with the fallout differently. And I agree with Ambassador Munter that Pakistan and the United States can have a different relationship, but unfortunately, it will not be the bonhomie of the past.
The Pakistan-United States relationship has another component, Afghanistan. This show was recorded on May 1st, 2021, on the 10th anniversary of the Bin Laden assassination. I asked Ambassador Haqqani for his assessment of Islamabad's Afghan policy. This was his perspective on the then impending withdrawal, months before Kabul was recaptured by the Taliban.
Well, I would say that the problem with Pakistan's Afghan policy is that if you define your interest very narrowly, then your focus will become narrower. Pakistan has an interest in having a friendly government in Afghanistan. That I understand. My suggestion is that the way to have a friendly government in Afghanistan is to befriend whoever is the government in Afghanistan. The strategy that our strategicians or our establishment has chosen is to try and influence who rules Afghanistan, and that is always fraught. What will happen after? First of all, I don't think there will be a substantive peace process. I think the US will get out because the US wants to get out. But then I think the Afghan government will definitely resist the Taliban. I think the Taliban will not be able to resist the temptation to try and take over Afghanistan again. And I think Pakistan, unfortunately, will be caught again between trying to deal with the Taliban, put some pressure on them to modify their behavior, but finding that they don't have any other potential Afghan ally that they can support. There could be an alternative approach, but that alternative approach is being advocated by somebody like me on Clubhouse with a group of you. It's not getting any traction in Islamabad or Rawalpindi.
The term AFPAC was codified by the late veteran diplomat Richard Holbrooke. Ambassador Munter proceeded to offer his own take on Pakistan's policy towards Afghanistan.
Yeah, I would just add that I think that one of the things that was very disappointing for me during the time I was in Pakistan was that the so-called AFPAC approach that the American government took did tend to look at Pakistan through the eyes, through the lens, as we would say, of Afghanistan. And I was always advocating for us to try to focus, as Joe Biden himself said, you have a country with 200 million people and nuclear weapons. You have another country next door with 40 million people. Which country do you want to get right? So my critique had always been in those days that we looked too closely through Afghanistan in order to see Pakistan. So the sad reality of it is now, as the Americans leave Afghanistan, it's very hard for me to figure out in which way America will have a role in that part of the world. But I just hope that the one bit of silver lining is that with American troops no longer in Afghanistan, that American leadership can look at Pakistan not as a hyphenated part of Afghanistan, not as a hyphenated part of India, but Pakistan as it is. And so I'm hoping that one piece of this, even if I have great fears for the future of what will happen in Afghanistan. That one thing that'll happen is that we might be able to take a more honest and perhaps more constructive role in our relation with Pakistan.
And I would just say that Pakistanis would have to start looking at themselves and presenting themselves in their own right rather than through a hyphen. They have to stop thinking in a hyphenated way. We have spent 72 years hyphenated either with India or with Afghanistan. And if we can't develop a outlook and a way of thinking in which, hey, we are looking after our own interests, we are a nation of 200 million people, we have India and Afghanistan and Iran and China as our neighbors, and we want to basically deal with the entire world without limiting our outlook to how our relations is with one or the other of our neighbors, then we will probably be in a better place. The rest of the world would be able to see us without hyphens if we stop seeing ourselves without hyphens.
I asked Ambassador Haqqani on Islamabad's often critiqued policy of viewing groups as good terror and bad terror.
The basic fact is that it was possible for Bin Laden to be in Pakistan because Pakistan has accepted and tolerated people like Hafiz Saeed and Masood Azhar. I mean, way back, Masood Azhar was an ally of Bin Laden. Fazlur Rahman Khalil, whose group Masood Azhar broke away from, the Harkatul Mujahideen, Fazlur Rahman Khalil was a signatory of Osama Bin Laden's famous fatwa or statement against the United States. So if Pakistanis really look at it carefully and honestly, they will realize that what they set up, as Hillary Clinton said, you can't have snakes in your backyards and think that they will bite only your neighbors. And Pakistan did nurture these snakes, and I think Pakistan would do well not to have any of them, not targeting India, not targeting Afghanistan, and not inadvertently targeting Pakistan's friends like the United States. And I think the Bin Laden episode should have made Pakistanis think that, but they didn't.
We asked Ambassador Munter about Dr. Shakil Afridi, the doctor who assisted the CIA in finding bin Laden by executing a fake vaccine campaign with the aim of extracting a DNA sample from members of the bin Laden family inside his own compound.
My understanding is that every effort was to try to get Dr. Afridi out before he was arrested. But once arrested, he went to prison. And interestingly, he was not sent to prison for helping the Americans. The way I understand it, he was sent to prison for helping terrorists. So it was a very difficult kind of thing. Look, I think that America probably could have been a little more creative. I personally feel that there were deals that could have been made where people held in the United States could have perhaps been exchanged for people held in Pakistan as kind of an effort to try to ratchet down the tension. But after the bin Laden raid, there was very little appetite in the American government for that kind of thing. So sadly, what we have is Dr. Afridi cooling his heels in a Pakistani prison for many years, and still, a lot of things that could have been cleared away had both sides been a little bit more creative, have not been cleared away.
While Pakistan is a poster child for complex civil-military relations, I asked Ambassador Munter on how civil-military relations were shaped between the Pentagon and the State Department during his time in Islamabad.
I wouldn't compare American civil military relations with Pakistani civil military relations, or indeed a number of other places. That is to say, as a general kind of conceptual rule. But in fact, there has been since 9/11 an increasing focus on solving problems with our military. That is to say, we are very good at doing things like dropping people out of helicopters and killing bad guys. And so when you have a desire in our government for immediate action, often that's where you'll turn. So I want to say this with some nuance. I mean, I don't want to make it into a blanket statement, but there has been a tendency since 9/11 to put more emphasis on the ability to use military and intelligence focus to solve problems than to build up our diplomacy. And indeed, some of the most kind of thoughtful military leaders have complained about this. David Petraeus, Jim Mattis, these people have all said, look, the more we focus on diplomacy through military eyes, the more difficult this gets. The American military is not built to find diplomatic solutions. What I am hoping is, and this is a bit of a pitch for the Biden administration, I'm hoping that what we can do is, yes, you need a strong military to back yourself so that your word is backed by power if you need it. But, kind of as John Kennedy said, we should never negotiate out of fear, but we should never fear to negotiate. Have a little faith in your diplomats. Have a little faith in your argument. I think we are a little bit out of focus on that, and I would argue it would be wise for America to focus more on diplomacy than on simple military solutions.
In his most recent book, titled Reimagining Pakistan, Ambassador Haqqani explained that reimagining Pakistan would also entail reimagining U.S.-Pakistan relations.
I think that obviously there's room for U.S.-Pakistan relations to be non-military, non-ally sort of conceptualization. No one's doing it. Moreover, it has components that are not necessarily government to government. So, for example, economic relations. There's only $6.5 billion worth of bilateral trade between Pakistan and the United States, considering that Morocco has more bilateral trade with the US than Pakistan. How can Pakistan expect to be a more important country for the United States in an economic sense? So all of that has to improve. But more important, Pakistan has to do a lot of reform at home. You talked about civil-military relations. Pakistan's civil-military relations are far from perfect. It's very complicated. The military is the dominant institution, and because of that, other institutions just have never grown. You talked about Dr. Shakil Afridi. Well, the reason why he's still in prison 10 years later, even though his sentence was for a shorter period, is because the Pakistani military intelligence services want to make him an example for anybody else who goes behind their backs and cooperate with the CIA or somebody else. Not for rule of law. So those are things that Pakistanis need to understand, that without those changes, even positive external relations are not going to be easy. It will always be a transactional relationship. America needs Pakistan for X. Okay, it's willing to pay a price for it, which is why it will not become a partnership or a friendship. Just to give you an sort of by way of example, India is 6 times larger in population than Pakistan. So it would make sense if India-US trade was 36 billion, while Pakistan-US was 6 billion. But the truth is, India's trade with the United States is $143 billion and growing. So that basically shows that there's a lot more activity, economic activity in India that is relevant to the United States than there is in Pakistan that is relevant to the United States. And Pakistan will have to come to terms with the fact that this is not the Soviet Union-focused Cold War anymore.
No, I very much agree with Hussein on this. And, in my personal capacity, I'm on the board of governors of a university in Karachi. I'm on the board of governors of an American company that is investing and doing very well in Rawalpindi. There is a whole world of society that is not necessarily defined by the diplomatic relations, where I think there's a great affinity for Pakistanis and Americans. And the more that reforms can take place, the reforms I think that Hussein is suggesting, that unbind these powers, that unleash the civil society economic prospects for Pakistan, that's when America is going to take Pakistan seriously in a very positive way. And not only America, other countries in the region. Pakistan punches beneath its weight diplomatically. And it's because, as Hussein has said, there's a sense if you see your interests narrowly, you will act narrowly. If Pakistan can make the kinds of reforms that will allow it to use the economic potential it has with 200 million people and a potentially vibrant economy, it can play a role which is very, very different than what it's done in the past.
Shifting gears from the political to the economic, Ambassador Munter gave his version of reimagining US Pakistan relations.
From my point of view, I don't think it was seen at all as a trade-off between Pakistan and India. I think, again, this seems to me simply to be a mindset among Pakistanis that, there's this zero-sum game that if Pakistan loses, India wins. If India wins, Pakistan loses. The whole American approach has always been that peace between Pakistan and India is what we would really like to see, and the prosperity of both countries winning would be a good thing. So I don't think that, at least in American policy circles, that the problems that Pakistan had was seen as a benefit or a payoff for India.
Pakistan's acrimony with India is also a major factor in their relations with the United States. Ambassador Haqqani explains why Islamabad needs to get over its obsession with New Delhi.
India's relationship with the United States has been growing for many, many, many reasons. And very frankly, I wrote something about it as early as 1992 when India started opening up its economy. I said, a market of 1 billion people is going to be far more attractive than us. That if the Indians stop blocking the Americans as they have done in the past and stop annoying them at the United Nations and other multilateral fora as they had done in the past, then maybe India will become more significant for the United States. And we should understand that. This is 1992. Unfortunately, the zero-sum game Cameron Munter alluded to has stopped Pakistanis from understanding that. The Indian diaspora is much larger, much more integrated. India does not have dual citizenship, so Indians who live in America and become Americans then become fully integrated in American life. Pakistanis don't. India's the number of Indian students in the United States is much larger. The economic relationship is much bigger. Those are factors that Pakistan cannot do anything about and should not worry about doing something about it, should stop thinking of it in zero-term games. More important is Pakistan's own relationship with India, which needs to be improved because India is Pakistan's neighbor and no country in the world does economically well without trading with its larger neighbors.
As Ambassador Haqqani looks back on his time in Washington, he reflects on his achievements, his regrets, and what he expects going forward.
I wanted Pakistan and the United States to be partners and friends for the long term. I think that Pakistan has always benefited from friendship with the United States. I had hoped that the anti-Americanism in Pakistan would diminish somewhat with more economic assistance coming for civilian purposes. I wanted Pakistan and the United States to actually look at the world together, possibly also block China's undue influence in Pakistan. None of those things happened. But c'est la vie, as they say. I'm sure Cameron has a list of things that he couldn't fully get done either.
No, I couldn't agree with you more, Hussein. The idea is, both of us were in an era that I think Hussein has alluded to, which is an American diplomat, kind of a larger-than-life figure, Richard Holbrooke. And this was a man who was a very difficult personality. If you read the recent biography of him by George Packer, which I very much suggest to you, what this man sought to do was to say, let's put this relationship, which has the potential to be a very, very healthy relationship, let's put this on an honest and straightforward path. And I think we were both part of that effort. Even though we were coming from different countries, we were part of the effort to try to do that. At that particular time, because of the events that we've discussed, that wasn't possible. It doesn't mean, however, that those goals aren't valid today, and it doesn't mean that there can't be another turn of the wheel. We all regret that we didn't get things done that we would like to have gotten done. I'd never found the perfect biryani, but I'll keep looking. And the fact is, at the end of the day, it may be that in years to come, Pakistan and America, if they focus on things like universities and business and youth and society, maybe we can be closer than we've been in the past.
And the reason why you didn't find perfect biryani while you were in Pakistan, Cameron, is because you spent most of your time in Islamabad, didn't go to Karachi or Sindh enough, and that's where you find the perfect biryani in Pakistan.
Well, I have to disagree with you. Even though I know there are people in this crowd who are kind of Lahore Rawalpindi, Islamabad kind of people. I'm a native of Los Angeles, and Los Angeles is the Karachi of the United States. And so I did my best to get into all the corners of Karachi that I could. And I'm still looking for that biryani. And next time you take me to Karachi, show it to me.
That was some precious food for thought from Ambassador Cameron Munter and Ambassador Husain Haqqani. We thank them for their time, insights, and candid conversation. The Global Detail was delighted to kick things off with such esteemed guests.
Join us next time on The Global Detail as we continue to go behind the headlines, beyond borders, to the stories that impact the world.